Say again, sorry.
I forgot I'm controlling the whole live stream after this.
Ah.
Super.
What have you got me billed as? Independent overlanding, it says in there. Is that all right?
Yeah,
That's
what I was
the
giving,
yeah.
so.
Okay, champion. That's lovely. Yeah.
Your mic's on, is it? Yeah.
I don't know whether it's on or off.
I'll check that.
Okay.
And I'll just give you the thumbs up.
All right. All right. Yeah. So we're on. Yeah. Okay. Morning, ladies and gents. Thank you for coming, and thank you for tolerating the possibly predictable IT messing about while one system refuses to talk to another, and this doesn't work, and that doesn't work. You all know what it's like. Thank you for coming, and I hope you're having a good morning at the show. My name's Sam Watson. I live in Cairo. I've been travelling in the Sahara, I suppose, for the best part of 30 years. And I'm one of those, I realise, I suppose, looking at it, I'm one of those lucky people who gets to travel and write about it. That's what I wanted. I wanted to share a couple of trips with you today, a couple of recent trips with you today. The tagline they've given me here, the title, if you like, is Independent Overlanding, and I suppose that's what this is. Both of these trips are ones that were planned and led and carried out by a group of what you might call enthusiastic amateurs rather than any tour companies. No guides, or certainly no competent guides were used. One guide was used for legal reasons, but was less use than ornament, and not much ornament. And on the second trip, there was no guide used. The first trip is going to be talking about Egypt in the Sahara, and the second trip is talking about Kenya. I have about a 45-minute slot, possibly an hour slot, and so I think it's probably best if we have a pause halfway through, and then, so if there's any questions, shoot them at me then, and then we'll also have a slot at the end. If you want to pass any feedback back or throw any eggs or anything like that, save it for that point. So, once again, thank you for coming, and the first thing I would want to Twitter about is travelling through the Sahara in Egypt. Egypt is, I suppose, imagine a big square. Egypt is at the top right, Cairo is at the top right-hand corner of this square, and the square roughly is a map of Egypt. So Cairo's at the top right-hand corner. Our destination was the bottom left-hand corner. Now, moving down the right-hand side of the square, you've got more or less the Nile Valley, which is the only fertile part of the country, really. And it's the reason the ancient Egyptian civilization was built there, because the Nile is fertile. You had this ribbon of green fertility, so that's where the civilization developed. That's where the pyramids were built, etc. And that's where Cairo is now, at the top of the green ribbon, as I say, in the top right-hand corner. It's an enormous city of over 20 million. It's growing over 1 million a year. It's a bit like an ashtray tipped into an ant's nest. It's a madhouse. It's a bit like the Muppet Show without the humour. Or a whole city run by Manuel from Fawlty Towers. But anyway, so it's crazy. The reason I live there is the desert. I love the desert. I always have since I was a kid. And as soon as I was old enough and I had the cash, I bought a Land Rover and headed off to the Sahara, and I've been trundling around it pretty much ever since. So this trip was a Christmas trip, not this Christmas, but the one before. The idea was we'd leave Cairo on about the 22nd of December. We'd have Christmas Day out in the Great Sand Sea, which is on the left-hand side of the square that you're imagining, or I suggested. The Great Sand Sea is the biggest area of sand dunes in the world. The sand sea itself is about the size of Britain. It's made up of great lines of north-south running sand dunes, like great blades. The dunes can be sort of, I guess, 80 to 90 miles in length, and they can be 100, 150 feet, 200 feet high. Because they run north-south, travel through the Great Sand Sea is best done north-south in between the lines of the dunes. If you want to get east-west or west-east, then you have to climb the dunes. And because of the wind direction, the most difficult direction to go is from the east to the west. But unfortunately, if you're coming out from Cairo, that's the direction you have to go. And I say when I say the most difficult direction, it's because that's the steep side. The steep side of the dunes is the east side. So the plan was to leave Cairo, Christmas Day out in the Great Sand Sea somewhere, head south from the Great Sand Sea, moving down the left-hand side of that mental square, to a rocky escarpment about the size of Switzerland called the Gilf Kebir. The Gilf Kebir is an area of black volcanic rock and red sand. And if you have an imaginative turn of mind, it looks a bit like Tolkien's Mordor. It's black, sort of black escarpments, black spikes of rock rising out of deep red, blood red sand. It's quite an eerie environment. The plan then was to cross over into Libya, skirt down the border, back into Egypt, and head for a single mountain peak, which is the border between Libya, the Sudan, and Egypt, called Uwainat Mountain. It's a bit like, again, a Tolkien image, it's a bit like the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit. It's the lone sort of spire of rock that sticks out of the desert. It's visible for miles around, and it was chosen by the colonial British as the meeting point of three borders because it's a nice, easy landmark to spot. So we crossed from the Gilf Kebir to Uwainat, and we crossed briefly into Sudan, and then back into Egypt, drive back to the Nile Valley, and then head back to Cairo. That was the plan. In doing so, we wanted to visit several historical sites of vehicle wrecks from the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group from the Second World War. We wanted to visit several prehistoric sites. 10,000 years ago, what is now desert was very lush, verdant savanna and grassland with antelope, gazelle, elephant, rhino, and prehistoric humans. In sort of landscape terms and wildlife terms, much like East Africa, much like Kenya today. So the inhabitants of the area at the time left cave paintings, rock art. For those of you who've seen The English Patient, the Cave of the Swimmers is a real place, and we were going to go and see that cave and some of the other caves and some of the other rock art left by those people at that time. And they wouldn't recognize it now. It's the most arid place on Earth. The hottest place on Earth, biggest desert in the world, but back then, 10,000 years ago, it wasn't. So we'd take in historic sites, prehistoric sites, and sites from the recent history, sort of Second World War as well, or pre-Second World War desert exploration. So it was going to be a big old trip. We're a group of expat friends that live in Cairo. I think on this trip we had 4 or 5 vehicles, all Defenders. It's a whole other story about maintaining a Defender in Cairo because you probably know all the way across the Sahara you predominantly find Land Cruisers or Defenders, apart from Egypt. Well, Land Cruisers or Land Rovers, because there's Syria's out there as well. Apart from Egypt, and the Egyptians fell out with the Brits in the sort of 60s and 70s, and so Land Rover imports, British imports generally just stopped. So there's very few Land Rovers in Egypt, but we seem to have most of them actually. I think between our group we've probably got about 13 or 14 vehicles. And getting spares in Egypt is a nightmare. We have to ship them in from the UK. But the reason we do it is for trips like this. Anyway, I've twittered at you enough. Let's get on with looking at the actual trip. So, guys at the back, is the visibility okay for you in terms of the photos? Can you see that reasonably clearly? I'm just aware it's very bright. Yeah? It'd be better if it was raining and grey, wouldn't it? No, maybe not. Anyway, so that's by way of a title slide. That's not Egypt. That's December the 22nd. We were prepping the vehicles, and this was a typical truck. This is actually a 109 rebuilt on coil springs. It's an old lady now, but it's a very, very capable vehicle. And you can see we were putting in fuel for the truck. So the truck has a 200-litre tank in the floor here, standard 80-litre tank in the back, and then we had 19 jerry cans being put in the rear. There was no possibility of fuel resupply on the trip once we left the first Oasis village. First Oasis village, typically, it's got 2 petrol stations, neither of which are guaranteed to have petrol, well, diesel in this case, neither of which are guaranteed to have electricity to make the pumps work. So we couldn't count on any resupply, certainly of fuel, from start to finish of the trip, and the trip was probably about 2,500 miles, something like that. So we had to take everything with us. So here you've got veg oil drums, wholesale veg oil drums, very common throughout Africa as sort of emergency jerry cans, if you like. and a whole pile of Soviet Army surplus jerry cans as well, all going in the back of this 109, and all of the trucks were pretty much similarly equipped. The 109 has a roll cage, which of course helps with the roof load. This was a 110 we were loading. As you can see, more veg oil drums of diesel going in, and other important supplies as well. Egyptian beer is rank, by the way. So that's the truck that we were packing. Roof load fairly substantial, 2 spares on each vehicle, large loads of water, large loads of fuel, obviously large loads of food, and probably on average 2 people in each vehicle. That was the one I was driving. So, I mean, because they're Land Rovers, they have names. That's Leroy. That's the Bentley, because it's been re-engined with the 2.8 power stroke engine, which has been tweaked and tuned, and it's well fitted out inside, so it's quick and it's powerful, hence the name. Again, outside, sort of pretty standard 110 roll cage, bull bar, twin spare wheels. That is legs. Legs, again, a 109 TDI, sorry, 110 hardtop TDI. Not much stuff on the roof apart from these things. These are big Bedouin windbreaks, which are pretty common throughout, certainly throughout Egypt, and you can find them in the rest of North Africa. Big cotton sheets with bizarre designs printed on them, and wooden uprights, and they make a very effective camp windbreak, but they are heavy and cumbersome. So we left Cairo very, very early in the morning on about the 22nd, immediately drove into traffic as everybody leaves the city. It's an Islamic country, but people do celebrate Christmas. A lot of people celebrate Christmas as a chance for a holiday, as is common throughout the world, so a lot of people were leaving town in the morning. A lot of the vehicles very typically have these twin jerry can mounts on the back, which wouldn't be legal in the UK for obvious reasons, well, for several reasons. And we immediately got stuck in traffic. This is not a particularly representative picture of Cairo traffic because everything's in its correct lane. Normally in a situation like this where you've got 4 lanes, you'd probably have 6 lanes of traffic crammed into it. But this morning everybody was behaving bizarrely, or at least in that 100-yard stretch everybody was behaving. Cairo is expanding at over 1 million people a year. 30 years ago this was open desert. There is, believe it or not, a canal down here which was famous for a number of years in the old 1920s, 1930s sepia photographs with trees along either side of it. Some of the trees are still hanging on there. The pyramids are just here, just to the left out of shot, and Cairo proper is that way. We're going parallel to the Nile here. So leaving town. We were to meet up with a 4th vehicle, the red 130 on the end. He lives in a different area of Cairo, so he didn't want to come through the city centre. He wanted to meet us at a fueling point outside town. So we'd already fueled up. We stopped in here to get some coffees and some bits and bobs and to wait for this 4th vehicle here. Hang on, how am I doing here? 1, 2, 3. Is there a 4th one? I think that's the 4th one. Can't remember. So we're waiting for him. We're also waiting for our guide. Now, to a man, we all hate to have guides along with us because especially in Egypt, guides are totally incompetent and dishonest, which is an awful sweeping generalization to make, but I've never found one that's in any way trustworthy or worth using. But because of the remoteness of the area we were going to, we had to have a guide, we had to have a police escort, and we had to have a military escort. Because we were crossing borders, we were going into areas where there is smuggling, human smuggling and arms smuggling. And this was, as I say, thick end of 2 years ago, but there was the beginnings of ISIS activity, or what became ISIS activity in the area, armed insurgency, and that sort of thing. So we had to have a guide and we had to have a military escort. We were picking the military escort and the police escort up in the first oasis village we'd hit, not yet, but we were supposed to meet the guide here. However, a bad omen, the guide didn't know where the garage was we were supposed to meet him. So we waited for an hour, and we got a 5-hour drive ahead to the oasis village, waited and waited and waited and thought, blow this, he's got lost, he can find us, he's a guide. So we drove on without him to this halfway rest house, which is halfway between Cairo and Bahrain Oasis, which was our first destination. So we're moving diagonally across the mental square in your mind now from the top right-hand corner to the middle. The oasis of Bahrain is in the middle. It's a 5-hour drive between the two, between Cairo and the oasis. In the oasis, we were going to pick up our police and military escort. This area, for those of you who with an ear to the news, picked up on the killing of 12 Mexicans, about a week ago. This is the area where they were killed. I won't go into the whys and wherefores of that, but it's an extremely well-travelled area, both by locals, by tourists, and by overlanders. Overlanders do still go through Cairo, go through Egypt on the way south to Cape Town. I'm in communication with 2 groups at the moment who are meeting in Cairo on about the 7th or 8th of October. For general information, Egypt is not particularly safe for overlanders at the moment as a through route going through to Cape Town, but people are still coming. If you have any intentions of going that way, please give me a shout and I can give you the latest heads up on what's going on. But it's not particularly safe at the moment for travellers. This area, for example, is totally off limits at the moment. So we stopped at the rest house again to see if the guide would find us and catch us up. Eventually he did. And then as night fell, we arrived in the oasis village in Baharea to pick up our military escort. We picked them up after much faffing around with paperwork and, oh, you're supposed to be going, no, you're supposed to be going, no, blah, blah, blah. We picked them up and we went off with them. And we headed out as night fell. You can't really see, so I'll skim through these. As night fell, oh, you can't see that at all. We headed out intending to make camp. However, I'd done a spectacularly stupid thing and bought a load of dried apricots, which I was eating, and then I drank a load of bottled water. And of course they expanded. So I started having intestinal fireworks as we were driving down from Cairo, and I swapped seats with my colleague so he could drive and I could hop out the door occasionally and zoom behind a dune and get rid of some apricots. So unfortunately he fell asleep when he was driving as we rounded a corner and the 109 rolled twice at about 60 miles an hour. And you can't see it because of the light conditions, but I mean the truck's on its roof here. It's fairly badly mangled. Loads of diesel came pouring out. My colleague was unconscious. I managed to scramble out. Fortunately, he was okay. The military escort pulled in behind us. They resuscitated him, although he was coming to anyway. And they managed to pull some of the gear out. But absolute testament to the strength and reliability of the vehicles. Another 110 pulled the vehicle up on its wheels, and it started first time, and it drove. But there were so many loose panels on it and bits and pieces on it that we didn't actually use it to carry on the trip. We sent it back to Cairo on a flatbed. But it was an interesting start to the trip. This is in Baharea, Farafra, the next oasis down, the next morning. So we had to repack the vehicles after the crash. Everything then went into these 3, but we still didn't have enough room to carry all the gear. So we then hired a local driver with a Hilux. He took a while to arrive, but finally, after much faffing around and about 2 days behind, we headed off south towards the Great Sand Sea. So now we're heading across the mental square to the left-hand vertical side, where there's this huge area of dunes the size of the UK. This is a very badly tarmacked road from a place called Ain Dala, which was a Roman camp and then was an SAS camp during the Second World War, and is now an Egyptian military base. So we checked in with the military and the border guards at Ain Dala and said, yes, we're here, and they said, off you go, so we went. And as soon as you hit the soft sand, you have to air tyres down. Typically, if you're running at about 35 to 40 psi, you need to air down to about 15, maybe 18 psi. You've got a 3-ton Land Rover there, it's pushing down, or a 3-ton vehicle there, it's pushing down into the sand with a tremendous amount of pressure. And ideally, therefore, if you can air down the tyres to about 10 psi, then the footprint of the tyre doubles, really, in terms of actual area of rubber in contact with the sand. And if you think back to your O-level physics, that halves the pressure that the vehicle is exerting on the sand, which makes a tremendous difference when you're driving in soft sand. Soft enough that it's difficult to walk in. And as the day heats up, the sand gets softer, because if you think about it, the air molecules between the sand particles, when the air gets hot, they expand, they push each other apart, they push the sand particles apart. So as the heat of the day increases, you're more likely to get stuck, especially sort of midday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Your sand is very soft, the temperature is very hot. Out here it can get to over 50 degrees C. Even at this time of year it was pretty seriously hot, even in the late December. So yeah, air the tyres down, pretty standard when you turn off tarmac. All the vehicles carry 12-volt compressors to air the tyres back up again. All of us were running 285s in terms of tyre size, which is oversized for a Defender, but obviously it helps with it helps with vehicle flotation. Here you can see various things going on. There's legs. This is taken from the top of the Bentley. There's the back end of the Hilux, which was the sort of vehicle we hired to carry the rest of the gear. This is the back end of one of the military Land Cruisers. And on the top of the vehicles, you can see these red flashes. They were given to us by the police. They said the area you're going through is subject to insurgent activity and there are military gunship helicopters in the area. And if they see red flashes on top of the vehicles, they will know that you're the good guys and they won't do anything about you. Okay, so we put the red flashes on. We're obviously safe from the military, we thought. So that's the Great Sandsea, the beginning of it. It doesn't look very duney, but then we started to turn south and you start coming into these large dune formations. So typically here, you've got an inter-dune corridor, very flat area with two lines of dunes, one here and one over on the right-hand side, about 1 kilometre apart. Sorry, I'm mix and match miles and kilometres, because in Egypt we think in kilometres, in the UK I think in miles, so I'm buggered either way, but anyway. So yeah, heading then south towards the middle of the Great Sandsea, and fairly late in the morning, so starting to heat up, Bentley in the lead. Police escort and army escort and guide way behind, not doing anything, just dragging along. The trouble is, you've got to take these people by law, but you've got to pay for them as well. You've got to pay for their fuel, and you've got to pay for their food, and you've got to dig them out when they get stuck, which invariably they do. So they're chocolate fireguard territory. Anyway, through the Great Sandsea, just a nice shot. I mean, you can tell it's winter because there are clouds. That's the only way you can tell, really. Predictably, the guide got stuck, and very well stuck, axle deep stuck, in his Land Cruiser with all his gear piled up on the roof and umpteen blokes inside. And I mean, we didn't know the guy from Adam at the start of the trip, but as the trip went on, we realized that he was making increasingly weird route choices when confronted with dunes or rocky areas. And he was regularly in this sort of situation, so we sort of made him join the club of unreliable guides. But anyway, we had to have him. So that became a fairly regular occurrence. But then we hit a snag. Egypt, as you probably know, has had a sort of turbulent political history recently, including a revolution. And so a lot of the fuel distribution has been very complicated and not always reliable. We'd fueled some of the vehicles up in Bahrain Oasis, and we'd used big 50-gallon drums to do so. What we didn't realize was that one of the drums had lousy quality fuel in it. So the 130, we were driving through the Great Sandsea, and the 130 was coughing and spluttering with fuel delivery issues. And so we basically had to strip out the entire fuel system and drain it and clean it. Because of this. This is decent diesel. This is the stuff we'd put in, and it looks like Guinness or soup. It's particulates, it's rust, there's water contamination in it, probably about 10% water contamination. It's grim. So the 130, even though it was a TDI, which ran on most things, the 130 wasn't very happy, so we had to clean out the fuel system. And so we carried on as dusk fell through the Sandsea. Spectacular landscape, very photogenic landscape, very beautiful landscape, I've got to say. I mean, it really is. If you're on a trip, I'm sure you know, it's very easy to get sucked into this whole world of charge, here the vehicle, it's great, isn't it? Adrenaline going, all the sort of adventurous thing. It's often nice to just kill the engine, get out the vehicle and stop and stand and look and listen. Because in an environment like this, you feel very small and very insignificant. It's like standing in a cathedral. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place, very tranquil, very peaceful, and suddenly you realize you feel quite intrusive driving through it in a tanking, great, noisy, diesel belching 4x4, and the rest of the landscape around you is absolutely quiet and peaceful. In the morning and in the evening, dawn and dusk, the desert is full of pastel colors. In the daytime, it's very harsh, very bright and very white, but in the evening, it's absolutely beautiful. Pinks, oranges, yellows, browns, lovely. So this was Christmas Eve, 2013. And again, because of the light in here, you can't see particularly well, but there is There's a camp here of vehicles. There's a 110 here, a 130 here, a 110 here. There's a group of us sitting in between them with a 12-volt Christmas tree. There's the campfire. You can see head torches around it. And that was Christmas Eve. Can you see the Christmas tree? Yeah, well, you can, believe it or not. Bizarrely, there's the Christmas tree there. Not a very good one. We didn't know we had it until my friend Sue produced it with a cheesy grin and says, "Ha-ha, we have this." Right. It was a fairly alcoholic. It was a good Christmas Eve. Christmas Day, and you can see the dunes. So we've been heading south through the Great Sand Sea, and we now had to make some distance towards the west. So we had to start crossing these dunes. And this is what I mean about the difficult direction to cross the dunes in the Great Sand Sea being from the east towards the west, because you get these steep slopes. And this is probably, 120 feet high. And you've got a 3-ton vehicle, and the conditions, the temperature outside is fairly warm, so you need to be just careful, you need to be aware of what you're doing, and ideally not hungover. There's one of the 110s halfway up the dune. So you tend to stick it in sort of low box second or third, give it a bootful and off you go. Keep your wheels absolutely straight, and as I say, low tyre pressures. You've got to be aware of a possible unknown situation at the top of the dune, because many dunes have a flat plateau at the top that you can stop on or you can drive on. Some dunes have a gentle slope going away. Usually these dunes facing west, this picture is facing west. Usually these dunes facing west, you have a gentle slope going down on the other side, but some have a sheer drop. And if you come blatting up the dune at about sort of 20, 30 miles an hour with your foot right down, I've seen cars take off at the top of the dune and go nose over tail down the other side, and a hell of a mess. So you want to avoid that. Big dunes can be an exercise in concentration. However, we made it through, and this gives us a chance for So these were the vehicles in the final assembled convoy. Police/military Land Cruiser, police/military Land Cruiser, Bentley the 110, Legs the 110. This 110 was called Larry. Sorry, wrong. This was the 130 called Larry, which joined us later on. Obviously missing is Leroy, the truck that was rolled. This is the Hilux that we hired as a load carrier to replace Leroy. And that's the 3rd Military and Police Land Cruiser. And as you can see, they had wedge loads of gear bunged on as well, and about 5 or 6 blokes in each, plus weapons. So, Great Sand Sea. As we moved through the Great Sand Sea, we ran into relics of the Second World War. This is what's called a flimsy. It's basically the precursor of the jerry can. It was made by Shell Egypt as a petrol can, and they were issued to British forces, or Commonwealth forces. It's probably it's a gallon, basically. But the army called them flimsies because they are flimsy, because they were very, very badly put together. And typically this seam here would rupture or would crack, especially on a long off-road trip, and you'd lose about 20% of your fuel. So the army weren't very keen on them, and when they started encountering German units, Jerry's, and looked at the vehicles they'd captured, and, oh, these fuel cans look good. Have you seen these jerry cans? Oh, yeah, they're all right, aren't they? That's where the term comes from. So, but typically and that was around 1942 when the jerry can was discovered, if you like, by the British Army. But 1940, 1941, in the early days of the Long Range Desert Group, before the SAS was formed, these were the issued fuel container, these flimsies, and typically they would take sort of 20 of them, 30 of them in the back of a Chevrolet truck, and they would chuck them out into the desert when they finished with them and just drive on, and this was one of them. However, we were making for this landmark, which is actually a Long Range Desert Group truck. It's the remains of a Ford, very early four-wheel drive, Ford 30 hundredweight, and the engine was seized. So obviously the engine is not here. You can just see the end of the engine down here. When we got down, we had a poke about the engine and prodded it and poked it, and it had seized. Now, typically this vehicle would be in a patrol of sort of 4 or 5 similar vehicles. So obviously the lads had a go at fixing it, couldn't, stripped all the kit off it, put the kit into the other vehicles, much as we did with the rolled 109, took all the kit out of it, put it into the other vehicles, abandoned it, and drove on. And it's been there ever since. It's a fairly well-known landmark in the Great Sand Sea. It's a bit sad, actually. You want to look after it and bring it home, but anyway, you can't, unfortunately. But A lot of the original fittings and bits and pieces are still there. The dash is still fairly intact. There's a few bits and bobs dotted around it. But anyway, yeah, long-range desert group truck. When we got further south in the Great Sand Sea, we started encountering pretty soft sand. And the 130 wasn't being particularly well driven. Typically in soft sand, you want to be using high revs to keep the momentum up. High revs and high speed, something like, as I say, low second or low third maybe. This guy was using high gears, low revs, and trying to get through by power basically rather than by torque, if that makes sense. Consequently, it kept getting stuck. Actually, that explanation wasn't very good, sorry. He was going slower than he should have been, put it that way. And consequently, he kept getting stuck. And a fully laden 130 is not an easy beast to try and push and try and recover. Going under the wheels here, we got various types of sand ladder. This is a Max Trax unit here. This is a, can't remember what it's called, but it's a folding sand ladder, a folding waffle board, basically. And obviously here we got some manpower pushing the thing out. And that had to happen quite a bit. So he wasn't having a good day because we had to rebuild his fuel system already, and then his truck kept getting stuck. But anyway. And then am I in the right place? Yes, I am. Then we discovered that in the previous recovery, 2 of the engine mounts had broken. And so we're stuck in the middle of the Great Sand Sea. Here we are. Dunes in the background. My friend Darryl, Canadian lad, owns Legs and the Bentley. This is Johnny from Scotland, who was our expedition doctor. Can't see who that is. That might be me. And then this is Nada, an Egyptian guy who owned the 130. And engine mounts are broken, 2 of them. Fortunately, we had 2 spare engine mounts. So how on earth do we replace engine mounts in the middle of the Great Sand Sea? Well, fortunately, the vehicle had a roll cage. So I got a ratchet strap, put it around the roll cage, attached it to one of the lifting lugs on the engine block. It's a 200 TDI, as you can see. Ratcheted the ratchet strap, it lifted the engine up, and so we could get underneath it, take out the damaged engine mounts and replace them with 2 others. So that was a couple of hours wasted, but we got on with it. So there we are, middle of the Great Sand Sea, lifting the engine out and replacing the engine mounts. In the meantime, this is my friend Carl from Sweden, who is a military historian and was writing a book about the history of the long-range desert group, and he was coming along on the trip. So he was updating the ship's log, if you like, as we were fiddling about with the engine. And then the 130 got stuck again. So we had to recover it, but the area in front of the vehicle was too soft to recover the vehicle. It was a slight rise, as you can see here, into another line of dunes. So we couldn't get a vehicle around in front to tow it out forwards. The area around the vehicle was very soft, so we had to do a very long line recovery from an area of firm sand to where the 130 was in an area of soft sand. We used 2 vehicles. We used 2 110s and did a bridle recovery, and it came out. So there you can see the 110 finally towing the 130 clear. And then we discovered that 2 of the half shafts had snapped because the driver was using a bit too much right foot in soft sand, and unfortunately it can happen. So this was Christmas Day evening. We were stripping down the rear half of the drivetrain, manual on the iPad, and guys underneath with head torches fiddling about. Fortunately, we had spares. This is not, by the way, one of those Land Rovers are unreliable stories. In my belief, they're not unreliable. What I'm trying to explain to you here is that you will often find unforeseen breakdowns, and it's all part of the adventure, actually. The deal is expect problems, take spares, plan for it. So this was December the 27th, beautiful clear morning. Most of us were sleeping in tents. So there's a tent over here, one of those pop-up Quechua things. There's another tent here, a bigger pop-up Quechua. Some of us were sleeping out on the sand, which is in my mind by far the best thing to do because you see the stars. And so crack on. We crossed the lines of dunes. We were heading south now towards Oinat. Oh, sorry, to the Gulf Kibir first. Last lines of dunes coming up. Not a particularly good photo, but you can see there, typical bedroom, sleeping mat, line of bags to keep the wind off. That's it. That's all you need, really. Nightfall, but we lose the benefit of that because of the bright windows. December the 28th, I think it was, on the morning, heading south again. Interesting area of the Sahara, this. It's the only place in the world where you find this stuff. It's called Libyan desert glass or silica glass. It seems to be that 500,000 years ago, there was some astronomical event, a meteor strike, a comet impact, something like that. There is a large crater under this area of desert, a big crater, but you can't see it because it's full of sand. You can see it on radar imaging. However, it heated up a lot of the sand in the area to the point where it vitrified, where it turned to glass. The silica in the sand turned to glass. So you get great big lumps of this stuff, which is the stuff called silica glass. It's technically, I think, the rarest semi-precious stone in the world. It doesn't look particularly exciting. It looks like very worn, old bottle glass, and you can hold it up to the sun, and it's kind of translucent. You can find smaller pieces that you can make jewelry out of, and people do. Rarely, and interestingly, you can also find arrowheads and axe heads made out of it, and they're very, very beautiful, but very rare. So this was, it's the only area where I know of where you can actually find this stuff. There may be other areas, but I don't think there is. Silica desert glass. So we drove through the area of the desert glass and had a look at it. This is kind of the border between the Great Sand Sea and the Gulf Kibir. So that was heading for the Libyan border, and that is the Libyan border. This sign says Masra, which is Arabic for Egypt, that way, and this way is Libya. There was very little here, apart from tracks of smugglers' vehicles, and you can tell they're smugglers' vehicles because they use the Michelin XS desert pattern tyres, whose tread pattern looks a bit like an Egyptian pastry, a bit like sort of small diamond-shaped honey-covered pastries called baklava. And so the tyre pattern, they're called baklavas. So we were saying, you know, they've come through here on baklavas, they must be smugglers. And they were. Typically they travel in 2 or 3 land cruisers with pickups, with loads lightly secured on the back. Typically they're cigarettes, 25,000 cigarettes, something like that. And if they encounter an army patrol, then they hit a quick release, dump the load off the back and escape on a lightly laden pickup, leaving the load behind for future recovery. Now, have I got past the point? Yes, I have. I'm sorry, I missed something out. After the 130 replaced his engine mounts and kept getting stuck, the driver got fed up, said he was feeling a bit under the weather, and dropped out of the trip, headed back to Cairo. So we had to recover the vehicle using some local land cruisers to tow it out because it wasn't doing particularly well on the fuel front, and we had issues replacing the drive shafts. So, sorry, I missed that bit out. So the 130 by this point has left the group. However, when the 130 was recovered back to Cairo, they ran across one of these smugglers' loads in the desert. I think something like 50,000 cigarettes that had been smuggled in from Libya. And of course they swiped the lot and took it to sell in Cairo. But anyway, so this is heading for the Libyan border. There is the Libyan border. There's Sue and Daryl and Johnny and the 2 trucks. And we crossed into Libya as night fell and then drove south heading for the Gulf Kibir. The reason we had to cross into Libya was the Gulf is a very irregularly shaped rocky escarpment, and it sticks out to the west in such a way that you pretty much have to cross into Libya to get round it. We weren't, well, I was going to say we weren't supposed to be there. It's kind of tacitly understood by authorities in the area that if you want to travel in this area, you have to do a few border crossings. So we were in Libya and running south towards an area called Wadi Abd al-Malik. There is a legend in this part of the world of a city called Zazura, a lost oasis city called Zazura. And this has been talked about for at least 600 years. In the 1800s, you could walk around in the bazaars of Cairo and buy a treasure hunter's book that purported to tell you where you could find lost oases and the treasure of this and the lost eye of the snake god or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And one of these books was called the Book of Hidden Pearls, and it talked about this city called Zerzura, which was lost out in the desert, and it was guarded by a white gate, which was locked, but near it there was a carving of a dove, and the dove held the key in its beak, and you could take the key from the beak of the carved dove, open the gate, go into the city, and everybody was asleep, and you could take what you wanted. And people believed this, and so they went out looking for it. And for hundreds of years, people went out looking for this city. The legend still exists, of course, and people have rationalized it and said, well, it must have been an oasis. And throughout the 20s and the 30s, people were still looking for this oasis. So the guys that formed the Long Range Desert Group were looking for it as some sort of historical relic rather than as some sort of a source of treasure. But anyway, so we were heading towards a thing called Wadi Abd al-Malik, which means, the Wadi means valley. So it's basically a valley through the Gulf Kabir. And it's one of the most likely sites for Zerzura. So we were driving into the Gulf, and you can see now the black outcrops of volcanic rock on top of this red sand, and this is only the sort of foothills. As dusk was falling, you can't really see that particularly well. It's better on a laptop screen, but there's a 110 silhouetted here very nicely against the setting sun with a great plume of sand behind it. And that was just at the entrance to Wadi Abd al-Malik. So we were going to make camp there, and we have made camp, but you can't really see in that picture, unfortunately. Couple of vehicles. We tend to camp in a U shape. Couple of vehicles with a third vehicle as the bottom of the U and a windbreak in between them. So we've got a nice sort of sheltered area because the wind in the Sahara is pretty relentless. It's always there. It can be a pain, and it often carries dust with it and sand. So the morning, in what we like to think of as the Valley of Zerzura, called Zerzura because it's named after small birds, white-capped wheatears, which in the Arabic for that is Zarzur. So that becomes relevant later on. The best way to fill the vehicles is to use jerry cans, but as you probably know, holding a 20-kilo jerry can like this and just tipping it, and then another one gets a bit tiring. So we use the roll cages as a support for the jerry can, and then we ran a siphon tube down into the fuel inlet. These siphon tubes, if you haven't seen them, they're very handy. It's a little valve connected to a length of hose, so you don't have to suck it and then siphon the fuel in that way. You simply rattle this valve, which has a ball bearing inside it, basically, and you set in motion a pumping system. Very simple system. They're about 10, 12 quid, these siphon hoses. And it draws the fuel out of the jerry can and puts it into the tank, and you just stand there and smile in an embarrassed way. Trasharoo, very useful piece of kit. We tended to fill it with bottled water, so we always had some to hand. Wadi Abd al-Malik by day. So you can see immediately there, you can see that there might have been some sort of settlement here once, because there's water around. There must be water around because there's this vegetation. The surrounding desert, there's no vegetation. But here in this wadi, yeah, there's vegetation, there's rock art, there's evidence that people lived there once. In fact, they did live there until the 20s. So maybe this is some sort of historical relic of something, I don't know. Wadi Abd al-Malik is a dead end. Normally there isn't a way out of it, but we managed to find a way. So we're heading west here, climbing out of Wadi Abd al-Malik, and towards the Libyan border again. Sorry, I should have explained, we crossed back into Egypt, and now we're heading back out towards Libya again. So we're climbing a rocky slope here, and then we've got a dune descent on the other side because the dune has climbed up to the side of the escarpment. There's the view from the top of the Gulf Kabir, looking west towards Libya. So this bit is Libya, this bit is Egypt, and the border kind of runs through the middle there. And so we'd climbed that rocky ascent out of Wadi Abd al-Malik, sat on top of the Gulf looking west, and we had to descend. The descent, just to jump one slide forward, the descent was a long ridge of a dune that dropped down like this. You can see the crest of the dune goes all the way down, all the way down, all the way down. So the route down it, and this is probably about, I don't know, 800 feet. The route down it was to follow the ridge of the dune down to about here and then turn the vehicle carefully and drop down the slip face. These are heavily laden vehicles. I mean, legs at this point probably had 300 litres of fuel in the back, a couple of hundred litres of water, 2 blokes, camping gear, wind brakes lashed on the roof, that sort of thing. I was driving her at the time, and the steering was a bit loose as well. So you had to really just be carefully, gently nosing the vehicle down, because if you get it out of true, if the back comes round, then you've probably got a long walk home. So we edged the vehicles down the dune. You can see just about down the bottom here, there's the Bentley down there already, and there's a couple of people wandering about down there. So one vehicle had gone down, I followed it down. But we made it down to the west side of the Gulf Kabir, and we looked then for the first of the cave sites. However, what we found was a long-range desert group sand ladder. We'd stopped for a cup of tea, and I saw something that didn't look like it was rock, wandered over, and it was the remains of a sand ladder, which is a traction aid. Near it were some players' cigarette tins and some other bits and pieces, some flimsies that had been discarded, the lids of the flimsies. So obviously the lads had stopped there to do something. The centre of this sand ladder has been cut out. So it could be that the vehicles needed some fabrication. Typically the patrols had a fitter's truck with them with welding equipment. So maybe somebody needed something patching up on a vehicle. They cut up a sand ladder, patched up a vehicle with it, dumped the sand ladder, and then carried on with whatever patrol they were doing. So there's Carl holding the sand ladder. It's come home now to the UK. I think it's probably the only one in Britain. Certainly the long-range desert group one. Where are we here? Yes, that's right. This is the Cave of the Beasts. We'd stopped here. This cave was discovered only in the early 2000s. This is 10,000-year-old rock art. Here you can see dancing figures. All seem to be male. Over here there are various other animals carved, including a bizarre sort of headless quadruped thing, hence the name Cave of the Beasts. Nobody knows who painted them. Roughly 10,000 years old, quite famous in the area. So we headed on to this place. This is the Cave of the Swimmers from the English Patient. And you can see why it's called the Cave of the Swimmers, because of these figures. Whether they're swimming, whether they're somehow flying, nobody really knows. But unfortunately, the environment, the sandstorms are taking their toll on the landscape there and on the rock art. And the rock art is slowly being destroyed and slowly fading away. Just aware of the time. We carried on south now, leaving the Gulf behind. No, not leaving the Gulf behind. We carried on to a place called Three Castles, which is west of the Gulf, which was a long-range desert group rendezvous point and lookout point. Here you can see the remains of a long-range desert group camp. There's some flimsies there, there's some food cans and cigarette cans there. We wanted to leave a plaque at Three Castles because I'd been there, there are two of the Three Castles, and there's the third. I'd been there the year before, actually 2 years before, in two 1943 Jeeps, Willys Jeeps, with Toby Savage, who was here last night. We were having a chat. And we'd left a plaque saying this commemorates the long-range desert group. We'd followed one of their patrol routes in similar vehicles to theirs, so we wanted to leave a memorial to them behind. However, someone has taken the plaque. You can see it's been prized off the rock here. I predicted that this was going to happen, so I took a replacement plaque with me and placed it in the desert very close by and hid it. A brass plaque made by a guy here in the UK and posted out. So that's out there. We left a wreath with it, memorial to the long-range desert group and the SAS of the Second World War. Quick fluids check on the vehicles at Three Castles, and then we carried on south to Awainat. On the way, we passed this, which is not a long-range desert group. It's called a heavy section truck. Long-range desert group patrols were resupplied by large six-wheel drive trucks. This is a white six-wheel drive 10-tonner, or the remains of it, from the heavy section that was abandoned when something mechanical happened to it. This is a cardboard box that would have contained flimsies. and that's a flimsy inner cardboard box. You find these things lying about. So now, if you think of your mental square, again, we're down in the bottom left-hand corner now. Two of the vehicles outside what's called Shaw's Cave. This is another cave out there. It was discovered by Bill Kennedy Shaw on a pre-war expedition, hence the name Shaw's Cave. And inside it, you find cattle of a type that you would now see in East Africa, long-horned cattle, typically like the Maasai herds you see in the savannas of Kenya these days. And heading southwest again, we found this, which is what was called a Sudan Defence Force vehicle, again from the war. It's got a big RAF recognition symbol on the top, a big RAF roundel on the top, in the same way that we've got the red flashes on the top to stop being shot at by Egyptian aircraft. This had an RAF recognition symbol on the top 70 years ago, didn't want to be mistaken for a German vehicle, so it was marked up as Allied. Heading south now, towards an area called 8 Bells. 8 Bells was a wartime airfield used for resupply of special forces in the field. The lettering is made of flimsies, hundreds of them, stamped flat, pressed into the desert. So here it says, as you can see, the name of the airfield, and there's a big arrow made out of flimsies pointing the resupply aircraft to show them where, because of course they didn't have radar, they didn't have sat-nav, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have computerized navigation. Some bloke with a map going, where is it? I don't know. Oh, there's an arrow. So that was their marker. This was an area that 2 years ago we weren't able to go to because of insurgent activity. So we were very fortunate and very pleased to be able to visit this time. And as dusk fell, we made for our camp point at the southern tip of Uwainat, where we did another fuel resupply, this time getting one of the big, these aren't veg oil drums, actually the yellow ones were. This I think is some sort of industrial cleaning liquid drum that we cleaned out and we'd reused as a fuel filler. Again, same job, ratchet strap holds it onto the roll cage, the jiggle siphon goes into the fuel inlet, and you just let it do its thing and it sits there and plugs away. So there's camp the following morning, southern tip of the Gulf Kabir, quite windy, quite rocky. And we headed south towards Uwainat. This here is a feature that you can only really appreciate from space. It's a meteorite crater called one of Clayton's craters, which was discovered in the 20s by a guy called Robert Clayton, East Clayton. Discovered from the air. And moving south again, 2 hills on the horizon, which recur in explorers' accounts from the 20s. They're called Peter and Paul because one looks like the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome, one looks like the Dome of St. Paul's in London, just on the edge of the horizon there. Peter and Paul, they're called on the old maps. And there's our lonely mountain looming in the distance. That's Uwainat. In fact, from this angle, it doesn't look like a rocky spire. It looks like an escarpment. That was our goal, and that's part in Sudan, partly in it. Well, mostly in Sudan, to be honest. So as the morning came up, this must have been probably about December 30th. And we drove into the escarpment of Uwainat, which is a bizarre basalt and sandstone sort of landscape, very alien. And lo and behold, what do we find? We found a zazur, a white-capped wheatear, and there's lots of them down there. So we have this weird sort of romantic thing going on. We're looking for zazura, are we? Ha ha. And here are the zazur birds escorting us. This is an acacia tree and a nice little oasis where we stop for a brew. This is the Sudanese border, this striped post here. So we crossed into Sudan here, and again you can see this sort of volcanic landscape, this red sand, very arid. The odd oasis is very welcome. Crossing into the Sudan, looking for a campsite. This is very typical of this part of the world. This is an area called Karkertal, which means Valley of the Trees, basically. And these are acacia trees, and this particular type of acacia weeps resin. And the resin drops out of the tree to fall on the rocks underneath, and from a distance it looks like water. So you can see a valley of these things and think, oh, pools of water, let's go and refresh ourselves in this stuff. Unfortunately, it's resin, it's hard, and it's not an optical illusion, it is really there, but you certainly can't drink it. And in Karkertal, again, prehistoric rock art, some sort of we're not sure what they were. Some people thought they were hunting dogs or cats, and some people thought they were horses. They seem to have features of both. These people seem to have bows. Again, probably about 10,000 years old. New Year's Eve in Kakatal in Sudan, and most of us have a taste for single malt scotch, so this was our annual New Year's Eve whiskey tasting. Hence the photograph's a bit blurred. And we'd carried a useful and valuable cargo with us. And after the whiskey tasting, we had a slightly bleary refueling session where we filtered some of the fuel. And it's a good job we filtered the fuel because this guy was pickled in it. I don't know how he got in it, but this is a very useful thing. It's called Mr. Funnel. It's a particulate and water filter that removes both from your fuel supply. Very handy. So New Year's Day broke in the Sudan, and we had to start heading back towards Cairo. So we set off. There's the border again. It's a shame actually we crossed at this point, because the next border post further down has Libya written on one side, and then it's been crossed out, and Sudan has been written underneath it. So obviously they were sort of, oh God, where do we put this? Is it this one? No, it's this one. So anyway, yeah, crossing back into Egypt from the Sudan. And it's a lovely morning. We were driving along, New Year's Day. Sorry, no, I'm ahead of myself. It was New Year's Eve. It was New Year's Eve. Driving along, we had probably here, a good couple of days' drive to the nearest oasis called Dakhla across the desert. So we were driving along, and we were the lead vehicle, Johnny and I in legs, and we heard a bang, bang, bang outside the vehicle. What was that? And I spent a while in the military, so I know what a rifle sounds like. I knew it was rifle fire. Now, in this part of the world, it's fairly lawless. There are smugglers, there are insurgents, and there are local nutters, some of which have guns. So I thought, well, we're moving fast. Somebody's had a pot shot at us. They've obviously missed. It's not worth worrying about. Let's just carry on. However, about 30 seconds later, there was a much deeper burst of automatic fire. And the Hilux that was with us was hit 13 times. You can't really see from there, but there are bullet strikes all over the vehicle. The load here has been pretty much peppered. All the windows have been shot out. There was a local guy driving it, and Carl, the Swedish guy, was in the passenger seat. The local guy took a round through his arm. He pulled Carl's head down into the footwell just in time, because some rounds came through the passenger window where Carl's head had been, and he would have been killed. Ironically, it was a local army unit, local army border unit. They had no idea we were there. Our police escort, our army escort, hadn't bothered to tell the local authorities that we were in the area, as they should have done. So they thought we were smugglers. We saw them. They had no military uniforms on. They had no markings on the vehicles, so we thought they were smugglers. So we legged it, and they chased us, each thinking the other was the bad guys. We outdistanced them, which is just as well, because this monster was chasing us. Land Cruiser pickup with a 12.7mm heavy machine gun in the back and 8 guys with Kalashnikovs. Not your best New Year's Eve party. We eventually sorted everything out. We came back to them. Our guide sorted it out. I mean, I was the lead vehicle at the time. There was gunfire behind. One of the guys came over the radio. I've been hit. It was the driver of the Hilux. And I said, keep going, keep going, keep going. My reasoning for this was because obviously when this thing is behind you, potentially it can hit you, even if you're driving fast. But my rationale for keeping going was, behind us, we've got our military escort. God knows what they're doing behind us. They should have been somewhere more useful, but anyway. So if there's trouble with these guys, if there's a firefight, they can deal with it, we can't, so let's get out of the line of fire before we're hit in the crossfire. So we got out of the way, it got sorted out. These are actually Egyptian military, and when they saw we had cameras, they started pulling on their uniforms, because they had football tops on. So somebody suggested they possibly do a little bit of moonlighting as poachers and bandits as well when they can, hence the civilian gear. the level of their competence can be judged from this, but also from the fact that if you look at their border post on Google Earth, it says "Welcome to Egypt" in rocks, in the sand near it. But the trouble is, it's on the wrong side of the border. So you see this "Welcome to Egypt" as you're leaving Egypt. So no wonder they shot at us. Anyway, so after this bit of a contretemps, my mate Johnny, who is he's actually Glaswegian, a doctor, and he was pretty angry. And you know what an angry Glaswegian's like. It's probably worth keeping him in a red box, break glass in the event of war or something. But he went off like a firework, and he was sort of heading for these Egyptian military effing and jeffing and this sort of thing, and just hang on, don't. And, you know, he was ready to have words. Fortunately, he caught himself and didn't. And he treated Nabil, the guy who'd been hit. As you can see here, we have a fairly comprehensive medical kit. Nabil's arm got hit by a round going through it, so he dressed the wound very well. The Hilux, we changed the tyre on it. We repaired its damage as best we could. Fortunately, no critical components were hit, so we were able to carry on. And while our guide faffed around dealing with the idiot military, we thought, well, blow you deal with that lot. We're going to crack on. We had a 19-hour drive across the desert to Dakhla Oasis, so we had to get on with it. There you can see one of the bullet holes in the Hilux. We were picking bullets out of that car for weeks afterwards. It was quite interesting. Oh, I found another one here. This was New Year's Eve. Happy New Year came over the radio. We were in the middle of a 19-hour drive through the desert to Dakhla, and we weren't really thinking of New Year. Of course we weren't. We were all knackered. We were all coming down from the adrenaline craziness of the previous few hours, worried about the state of Nabil's arm, worried about the state of the vehicles, one thing and another. And then Johnny perked up. Oh, hell, Happy New Year. Oh, yeah, right, okay. So, next morning, we'd found a hotel in Dakhla after a 19-hour drive and pulled in there, and everybody's staggering around like zombies, as you can imagine. And then we had a drive from Dakhla along the tarmac up towards Cairo, which was in itself a long drive, and along the way we had various issues because we didn't have passports because the guide had them. The guide by now had disappeared. Or it was wrong, we didn't have copies of passports because the guide had them. The guide also had our desert permits, so we had all sorts of issues with police on the way. In the end, we pulled into Baharea, the oasis where we'd originally picked up the military escort, and I rolled in last. I was driving the damaged Hilux. No glass in the windows, bits of sort of metal raining down and God knows what. So it was an interesting drive. And I rolled in at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and my mate Darryl came up to me with 2 steaks and half a bottle of whiskey and said, "Happy New Year." And I went, boom, gone. So that was New Year, and then we tried to fill up the next morning. Baharea, as I mentioned earlier on, issues with fuel supply. So there's this great long line of vehicles wanting diesel. We thought, blow that, let's go and find somewhere else. So we drove on towards Cairo and headed home, really. That's the end of that trip. It was an epic trip. It was good. There was some interesting bits and pieces on it, but it was good. And it's I won't say it's a fairly typical desert trip because you shouldn't expect to get shot at or roll vehicles, but certainly the landscape we went through was pretty typical, and the desert is not an empty place. People think it's just dunes, it's boring, isn't it? No, it's not at all. Rocky escarpments, prehistoric, historic remains, that sort of thing, quite interesting. I've probably gone over my elapsed time or allotted time, so I think we'd better miss out the second part. But guys, very quickly, do you have any questions? Desert travel, overland travel, that particular trip? I haven't, and unfortunately I'm flying back to Cairo in about 5 hours, so I'm not going to be here for much longer. But I can be around if you want a natter. Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Yes, sir. There's a face I know. Don't worry. That's very, very good of you. Very, very good of you, but thank you. No, I don't want to run over. Thanks, David. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying awake, and enjoy your time at the show. Thank you very much. Was that all right? Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, don't worry.
I'm just going to cut the stream a second.
Yeah.
You were talking about Kenya,
Say again?
you were going to talk about Kenya, were you?
Yes, I was.